Oh, I don't have need for this. I didn't bring any charts, so if you want to tweet, you'll have to tweet me. The reason why I didn't bring any charts is we're kind of doing a two-parter. I've known Paul Davies from Boeing for, I think, a little over a year now, and so he and I seem to gravitate around these same events and talk about very similar topics. So this time we decided to coordinate a little bit and me take sort of the topic in a different direction than he's taking it, and then we'll call Paul up and he's going to give some sort of more substantive data, some of it you've seen before, and maybe give some indications of what's going forward in the future. I think the topic, just to remind myself here, is basically how to measure the effectivity or the impacts of augmented reality in the enterprise space, which is apparently the theme of all of these afternoon sessions, and a lot of interest and excitement around the enterprise space because there seems to be sort of a dramatic pull coming from that space right now. I had some very kind of high-ranking fellow in the government talk to me about sort of a phrase that's been going around called, this is the end of the beginning of the information age. And so when you think about what that means for a second, it has to do with distribution of information. And there's a similar kind of, or an analogous historical sort of tale, if you will, and if folks are at 40 Expo, you maybe saw the person I'm referring to talk about this. His name is Philip Zelikow. Philip, Executive Director of 9/11 Commission, University of Virginia professor, very sort of well-respected scholar, if you will, both historically and then in the government, sits a number of boards. Well, he talks about the historical vantage of if we were 100 years ago in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, and we were talking about the advent of electricity. So how did the Industrial Revolution start? It started with a steam engine. And for those who know your history, it created federated work environments where people gathered around a steam engine in a workplace and they did power-assisted tooling and power-assisted manufacturing. But those type of people were very specialized. They were specialized workers, they were trained extra and all this to work with these sophisticated tools and equipment. So then electricity happened and Edison happened, and at first everyone said, wow, this is unbelievable, this should be everywhere. But it took 30 years for electricity really to take hold. But what electricity did was it took us from a federated power system to a distributed power system. Basically, with no loss of efficiencies, which what the mechanical systems would give you, you were able to distribute power across your entire factory floor. So now you could have every station on the factory floor equipped with power tools. So the reason why this is important and very relevant is that when this started to occur in the early 1900s and into the 1920s and 30s, America fundamentally reinvented itself. We went through and we picked ourselves up by our bootstraps and said we're going to mandate high school education. Our literacy percentages went up through the roof. Prior to 1900, very few people could read, write. We mandated people being able to read and write, and we embraced this new technology called electricity. So now how does that relate to today? So today we fast forward and we're in the midst of the information age. But the information age, much like the industrial age, it started through sort of a federated system. And if you look at most of the efficiencies that we've garnered, and we've heard speaker on speaker talk about this, they're very federated and localized. There's a control room with access to data. There's a control room with access to information. But then when you distribute that information, we're still doing that in a very sort of arcane way, or a 20th century way, if you will. So we're still doing things like paper, we're handing out 2D drawings, we're having people do checklists as they go maintain things, and then they come back to this hub, which is our analogous federated steam engine, if you will, and then they say, hey, here's what I found out, boss. And then the boss may put into the computer system the data or whatnot. So now we're at the burgeoning of this next phase of being able to distribute. So this idea of the Internet of Things, people, data, machines, and connecting people, data, and machines, but more importantly, it's the distribution of information. It's allowing people right at the right spot, take in the information, and make actionable results of it. So it's pretty big, and how AR fits in it, to me, is quite remarkable. And I'll get into that in a second, and then I will get to actually measuring AR, and then I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleague to really drive it home. So beyond all the complexity and the big cloud type of a thing and visions and pie in the sky about distributed information age and everybody being an information-powered worker, where are we at today, and where are we at with conveying this information? And an earlier speaker talked about it, I think, pretty well. What we really have and what we're burgeoning or what we're messing around with is a really powerful process improvement tool. So folks that do have experience in the art of process improvement and everything else, when we're looking at this type of process improvement and trying to figure out how do we measure the impacts of it, the first place that I would do is open up a Lean and Six Sigma book and start looking at the same methods that we calculated differences in goodness in that phase of sort of this process improvement rollout to this new 21st century way we're going to do process improvement and process rollout. The difference is we're kind of in this pioneering land, as we all pretty much know who sit in the room here today. We're not really sure how to measure all of this. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, we have the new kind of capability to very cheaply basically put digital information affixed to real-world objects. But that's really only half the equation. That's the AR half the equation. Well, in order to do that, we actually also have to have a bunch of sensors and cameras and everything else to provide the relative tracking to do that. So those cameras actually provide a whole host of sensor input that it actually can passively collect. So we're not only mobilizing information, we're taking our workforce and creating potential human sensors, if you will, that can be walking through a workplace or a map or everything else. I talked in a recent thing down in Houston with some of the folks from British Petroleum who had mapped their entire facility in the North Slope of Alaska with a LiDAR scanner and had 3D mapped it and had a model of their entire, I forget how many, 29 million square feet or something ungodly like that. Well, up at that facility, they have a problem with configuration management because they're still using paper and this, that to make changes. So in order to equip someone with a wearable or something that you're going around the plant doing things to be able to take in information, sense a change, and then transmit that back to headquarters is very powerful. And that's, of course, just one sample of the type of sensor inputs that you can get. You can get a whole wide variety of different sensor inputs with their technology. So now on to the question. So it says how to measure the impacts. I think first question, going to Six Sigma, back to the Six Sigma, back to the process improvement type of framework, it's, one would ask, what do we measure? Before we say how to measure it, we say, well, what do we want to measure? I think that's the real first question. I mean, the most obvious one is money. How do you figure out what, the quote unquote hard savings are? Hard savings in the art of Six Sigma is real dollars and cents that actually go to the bottom line. There's a lot of this idea of soft savings in Six Sigma for those that aren't familiar with it, which are like cost avoidance. If we wouldn't have been here, then you guys would have spent way more money than you actually did. And that always got kind of a bad rap when it really came down to it, because no one really believed that at the end of the day. They want to see hard savings to the bottom line or hard growth to the top line. And I think there's elements of both in this space. So when we look, or when we go to attack it, everyone gets a little uncomfortable when you say, okay, I've got an application, I'm trying a pilot program that's going to help people inspect for rust spots on oil platforms, for example. Now, to inspect rust, so right now, currently with oil platforms, people walk one end to the other end, and it's a lot of laborious, sort of man-intensive thing. At the end of the day, if we're able to do something a lot more efficiently with this technology, what does that equate to? That equates to less inspectors. or we say, well, we'll repurpose them to do something else. So there is an element of uncomfortability in any process improvement environment when you're talking hardline, because you're talking about shutting down plants or eliminating people and eliminating people's job. So I don't, obviously that's part of the business and we need to kind of accept that, but on the flip side of that equation, there are actually revenue gaining opportunities. And I'll talk about one particular example, and it has to do where batch processes actually equate to revenue loss. And there's a number of examples, refineries, power plants, but the one I'll talk about real quickly here is infrastructure. So infrastructure or cellular towers and stuff, a lot of people that are in the space or aware of the space, they know that the big carriers, they get money or revenue based upon time up. So downtime equates to lack of revenue. So the more time they can keep the antennas up and running, the more time they can obviously make more money, and it's a pretty significant amount. So currently right now, old school way of doing things, they have a number of service people that are distributed across the country. And they're outfitted with digital camera, laptop, safety equipment, all these different pieces of equipment, disparate, different pieces of equipment. And you may have an expert in amplifiers, and you may have an expert in antennas. And there may be a cellular antenna with cellular tower with an antenna problem, a cellular tower with a amplifier problem. The amplifier guy is sitting right next to that one. The antenna guy is right next to the other. And literally today, in a lot of situations, they're driving hundreds of miles to the opposite antenna. Second, they get up the tower, they do the repairs, they go through their book, they go through their manuals, they're fumbling through this. They're required, in order to get paid to do that service, is to document their actual work with digital pictures. They take the digital pictures, in theory, they go back to their hotel, in theory, they log in with the laptop that they were issued, in theory, they upload the digital pictures, they send them in with a report back to their agency, and then the agency gets paid, and then eventually they get paid. The problem when I keep saying in theory is a lot of these workers aren't sophisticated. They're not technologically sophisticated, and of course they're not game. None of them are game to go back to their hotels after they get a day, 12-hour day of working out in the sun on top of an antenna tower. They're looking to go hit a bar and drink some beer or do something like that. Anything but go back to their hotel and do this. So as a consequence, these providers of these types of services have a whole staff of surveyors. And so they kind of just dial into their money, dial into their equation, a 50% upper or whatnot, in order to get the surveyors to go back to the same antenna, take the pictures that should have been taken in the first place, and then transmit them up. So although this doesn't have a lot to do with AR, taking pictures, if you have cameras on the devices or the wearables that you're using, obviously it becomes very easy to start to automate things like taking pictures and then transmitting them automatically and so on. So, when we're looking for ROI, what I call the low-hanging fruit, the easy applications to provide that make the biggest difference for the return on the investment is what you're searching for. So time, I'm running out of time up here, so I'm not going to go into time. I had a couple examples. Rework, people familiar with rework, this is the idea that you do something and then at some later stage in the product development or product manufacturing, you discover an error and you have to go back and do it again. A lot of companies, like Raytheon, like Boeing, they actually measure the amount of rework. They try to anyways, with varying results. But in any case, they have a worker that goes into the system and actually goes into the ERP system and in their time card puts in there whether they were doing work, like first-time work or rework. And they measure that number as a metric because it's so impactful to the bottom line and to the success of a program. So when you're talking to different agencies, you ask them about the concept of rework, and depending on their robustness, they could measure that as an actual element which they can reduce, and they have formulas that translate it over to money. A big one that is very low-hanging fruit and very easy to provide additional capabilities with is safety. And this is one that, going back to my infrastructure example, last year this company that I was talking with and dialoguing said 8 people fell from cellular towers and died in 1 year. And although they never came back with the root cause being, the equipment and everything else, there's kind of this undertone or undercurrent that you got these people sitting up there with their cameras, fumbling through this, fumbling through that, trying to manage all of this stuff. They lose their balance and fall. So the right tools for the right job, and when we're looking for low-hanging fruit, another one, I'll just give you another one because those of you that are familiar a little bit with the idea that of our smart helmet, we have a camera in the back of the hard helmet. And I was talking to someone that manufactures hard helmets, and he was the CEO of a company called JSP over in the UK. And this guy said, well, wait, you have a camera sitting out the back of the helmet? Wow, that's amazing. He goes, well, could you write an application that would somehow flag or warn the user if a forklift or a mining truck is backing up into them? I said, oh yeah, that's a day's worth of work, if that. That's easy to do. He said, wow, you have no idea how many injuries and deaths result in forklifts and big trucks backing up into individuals. So when you're thinking about return on investment, when you're dealing with these companies, I would cast sort of your ideas and cast your discussions, not being so myopically focused on augmented reality, augmented reality, augmented reality. Augmented reality is but a tool. And it brings to the workplace or the workforce a set of sensors, a set of capabilities that can be very, very, very significant. And if we kind of narrow our focus to just focusing on, well, what's AR and what's not, then we kind of lose sort of that low-hanging fruit that I'm discussing or I'm describing. So this would be my recommendation. Finally, a sense of morale. I said, this is actually neat technology. And if you think about it, and I'm going to go real quick to frontline workers, if you think about, electrical workers that go out in ice storms and fix your power lines, or firefighters, EMTs. Philip talks about, going back, referring to Philip Zelikow again, he talks about a new class of worker that could potentially, so rewind again to the historical perspective, and we mandated high school. He views, this age with a necessity to create a new type of school, a new type of training, a new type of a class of worker that gets paid more, perhaps, than the class of worker that doesn't have these tools and are able to use things that are information age equipped. So you can imagine the EMT that was, having some procedure that they've never done before, but can pipe in a doctor that can look through the cameras and teach the EMT how to do it. Well, there would be some amount of requisite training to be able to transition or to evolve themselves to that type of a capability. I mean, I doubt very seriously if hospitals and EMTs would allow those sorts of things to occur without some significant amount of training for the person. Well, create a school that's not quite at the collegiate level, not quite at the white-collar level, but somewhere in between where someone comes straight out of high school and gets thrust into the workforce, versus this kind of information or silicon collar, silver collar, you could pick the color of collar worker that makes sense. All right, so now I'm going to kind of conclude, because the last bit is how, and I'm going to say how, and then I'm going to turn it over to Paul to kind of really bring it home with some practical examples of this. Well, being sort of a pioneering technology, being sort of on really the forefront, again, I'll refer back to what I talked about earlier, we don't have significant data or a historical model that exactly fits what we're trying to tell these people to go off and buy. And therein lies the rub. We can't just see all these people that did this and it all worked out for them. So we're sort of like when you invent a new technology, and they call this process of maturing technology readiness level, or technology development in the government. It's sort of like that in the aspect of augmented reality. And where you see the very, very early stages of people sort of proving out the worth is in university. So one thing I would point to, and DAQRI is doing it, Boeing is doing it, a number of other people are doing it, they're partnering with universities in order to conduct, at either us paying or Boeing paying, or even at free of charge sometimes if the university is willing to do it, to university studies that are well-controlled, well-conducted, and they're putting information out there. And because I don't have any area charts or area branded charts, I could just say area is a good centralized location to kind of give those studies, or point to those studies, and everything else. So all the folks that are in new augmented reality or established augmented reality space, I would highly encourage you to get papers out there, get research done, partner with the universities, because places like Iowa, Purdue, University of Illinois, MIT, and a number of others, they're very, very bullish on creating this kind of research and starting to kind of invest in the technology. The second way to do it, and again, a way that DAQRI has embarked on this year in a significant way to do, are these pilots. So again, somebody had made mention in the speech that Six Sigma is a good place. That's a good place to go. There's innovation groups. Siemens has an innovation group called Technology to Business. Is a whole sort of business that's been chartered with taking new technology, maturing it, and then selling it internally to the different Siemens business units. To get with those folks and develop pilot programs that are significant, they're real applications, they really have utility, and then you're using them within their framework to define what the actual return on investment experiment looks like. So it's kind of like they're invested into the discussion. And so when they take it to their management and say, look, these are real ROI numbers, guys, it's actually real. It's not, and it's their data, not just your data. So that's the second phase, if you will, of what I would call a good how to measure impact. Now the third's going to be a scaled rollout, and what the decision makers will say at this company is, yeah, the innovation group, yeah, university studies. All of that is subject to change when we actually try to do a scaled rollout within the company. So this is kind of like this, whatever that threshold's called with fusion reactors making more power than they consume to control them or whatever. This is this barrier that we're waiting for, and maybe Huntington Ingalls will be one of the first companies to do it, where they scale the rollout, they actually do it wide area, and then they measure the results. And my belief is that all of the indicators, the university indicators, the pilot program indicators, everything point to such a significant improvement in productivity and a significant reduction in human error, that when we do scale this, we're going to see significant gains, and then the real tsunami of the industrial and enterprise space will happen, where everyone is rushing to get some sort of an augmented reality or an Internet of Things program up and running and at scale, because the true sort of impact of the cost savings or the revenue garnishing will be realized. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn over to Paul to give you some examples of what I just went through. So, thank you.